I am going to invite our panelists up to the stage one by one. If I can be joined by Keith Daniel, co-founder and managing director of Resilient Ventures. Luann Flanders-Stec, fund executive of First Launch Capital Fund. And Tim McLoughlin, partner of Cofounders Capital. You hear me? Great. All right. So before we talk about growth in funding in North Carolina, I'd like to know how many entrepreneurs in this room have raised capital. Can you stand if you're an entrepreneur in this room that has raised capital?
We need to fund some more entrepreneurs.
Yes, that's why you're standing. Stay standing, please. If you're an entrepreneur in the room, but you have not yet raised capital, please stand.
Well, there we go.
Pay attention to this room. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Let's give them a round of applause. I'm going to assume that if you are present in this room at this conference, you are what we would call, or what I would call, an ecosystem ally. Okay, you believe in the ecosystem, you value the ecosystem. But we cannot talk about growth without talking about advocacy. It's just not enough to believe in it and want to see it succeed. And so what I'd like to know is how many in this room are ecosystem advocates, meaning you actually, in what you do, take action to grow and sustain the ecosystem. Fabulous. Because that is what is absolutely critical in order for growth to happen. And so we wanted to start there because our panelists today are all ecosystem advocates. So let's talk about the ecosystem itself. One of the reasons I'm so impressed by the entrepreneur who just left the stage a little while ago is because when I looked her up, she had raised over $1 million in capital. And just a few statistics. In 2021, of the $330 billion in venture, only 2.4% went to women, 1.3% to Black founders, 2.5% to Latino founders. And this year, those percentages have gone down. In North Carolina, in 2021, $3.6 billion in venture was raised. 70% of that went to 2 founders. 2. So it seems to me that perhaps it's not necessarily a funding issue, but a funnel issue. So we're going to start our discussion by talking about the funnel of funding and where it's going and why. I'm going to ask, testing, all right. All right, you didn't like my topic? All right. I'm going to ask each of our incredible panelists to introduce themselves and their fund before we begin so that you all can have an idea of what it is that they do and invest in.
All right, I'll kick it off. Can everybody hear me? All right, my name is Tim McLoughlin. I am the managing partner of Cofounders Capital. Cofounders Capital, we are investing out of our 3rd fund. Well, we haven't made an investment yet, so we got a lot of dry powder. But it's going to be a $50 million fund. We raised about $46 million of that so far. To seed stage B2B software companies, primarily here in North Carolina. And so we're investing at the early stages. I know a lot of you have heard from investors that they need to wait, you're too early, get back to us with some traction. We've invested most of our deals pre-revenue, so we go pretty early. It's hard to deploy a bigger fund into those early companies, but we're still working on it and hoping that we can keep that mission alive. So far, we've invested in 32 companies over the last 8 years. 29 of them have been here in North Carolina, and over $40 million put back into this ecosystem. So there you go.
And I'm Luann Flanders-Stec. I'm the fund executive for First Launch Capital Fund. Thanks for the shout out, Grace. And I run a pre-seed stage fund that is small on purpose. We raised $1.1 million. We're seeding absolute pre-seed companies, no revenue, sometimes not even a product yet. And we're really investing in founders. And so we have deployed little less than half of that funding and made 7 investments. The thing that we're excited about is we've more than doubled, we've invested about 450 of the fund in 7 companies, and we've actually deployed almost 1.2 million in total. So we're levering our investor base very, very well in the last year. We've been around for about 3 years, and our key is we only invest in the 12-county Piedmont Triad region. So we're very, very hyper-focused on our ecosystem right here.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Keith Daniel. I'm the co-founder and managing partner for Resilient Ventures in Durham, North Carolina. We focus on African-American, majority-led or owned early-stage companies with revenue. We've invested in 11 companies so far. We're fairly agnostic in our investment thesis, although we've, over time, started to recognize we were leaning towards B2B, SaaS or tech-enabled companies, but we have a few other sectors that we're in as well. It's our first fund. I'm an emerging manager, really kind of sitting on this stage now. I'm just 4 years into it. We made our first investment in 2019 in a company out of Chicago, a woman-led company that just raised $4.2 million, which puts them in a really top 10% in that way. Really proud of that initial find. And again, very serendipitous how we found that, and I'll maybe have a chance to unpack that. But our most recent investment was a company called the Diversity Movement out of Raleigh. Tremendous team of expert consultants in the DE&I space. Really proud of that. Yeah, it's been exciting for me just to be in the space. Lebone is one of our champions in chairing our investment committee, and it's been a good journey for us. We learned a lot.
That's great, thank you. And so each of you, as you introduced yourself, you talked about your investment thesis, or at least a portion of it. And we know that, and for those of you who have not raised capital, we'll just state it, that the investment thesis is a key to understand when you're seeking capital. Every firm has a different one, and it is required for their investors to ensure that they are investing the money the way it is intended to be invested. So that's the simplest way I can explain it. The LPs who put their trust in your fund believe that you will invest the money according to the thesis. So talk to me about some of the challenges you all see related to, in your process of investing and selecting startups, in putting your investment thesis to work.
Yeah, just like, do you guys mind if I start? Go. Sorry, I just kind of jumped in there. So just like when an investor comes starting a company and talks to potential investors, VC funds, whatever, and you tell them that you want to be focused, right? You got to be focused. You can't just say, give me money, I'm going to make you a lot more money. You have to tell the story. When we go out to raise money, we're raising this from mostly high net worth individuals, some corporations, some family offices. We have to tell that story. Why do they want to diversify into our fund? Why do they want to invest in this certain sector, this geography, this type of founder? And so when you do that, you create your fund thesis, and if you don't want to get sued on a deal that loses money, you should stick to that fund thesis. So what challenges do we face? Well, I remember seeing Grace's plan when it was coming through NC Idea and hearing about Unboxed Address, and it's one of these things where you think, that's going to make somebody a lot of money, but I can't write a check. And the hardest thing about what we face is when we see a really great entrepreneur, a really great business, and in my email response back to them as to why we're not investing, it is, we really think you're going to make a lot of money on this deal, and we really think you're going to make a great investor return, but we can't invest. It just sounds, it doesn't sound genuine, it doesn't sound honest. It sounds like, okay, there's some other reason that they won't let me know why they're not putting a check in. But really, it's because of the fund thesis that we stick to. And the biggest challenge I have is when I cannot point that entrepreneur to a resource that I know could give them capital. If there were more funds, if there were more early stage managers, small funds writing checks with more leeway, it'd be a lot easier to point those entrepreneurs in the right direction so that they could raise capital, they could create those successful businesses. That's the challenge that we face.
I think our biggest challenge is we've got a broad thesis from tech-enabled, and so it's not real specific, but it is still specific. And then, of course, we've got our 12-county region. You don't want to know how many applications. I just say, thank you, but. Thank you, but. So I think part of this conversation needs to be to entrepreneurs as well, is to understand that we are there, and that's where we have to live. I do not at all want to be sued by one of our LPs. I know them all really well, and I definitely don't want to do that. So just understanding that piece of it. One of our challenges is even having, and I love our ecosystem, and this is, we said this was going to be a really bold and blunt conversation. One of our challenges is we need some more been there, done that entrepreneurs that we can really support in their next deal. And so we're working really hard on the other hat I wear, and so many people in this room, in this community, are doing the same thing to help entrepreneurs be successful so that they can do their next deal and their next deal and begin supporting the community. And so I think that's one of the pipeline challenges that we are dealing with.
Well, the joy for me is that the challenge wasn't there in the same way. Our thesis was early stage scalable companies led by African Americans. And it was like a candy shop for me in that regard, just to look around the country through my network. I've been in Durham for over 30 years, very plugged into the university systems, lots of relationships throughout the Mid-Atlantic and the Southeast. And we set about, my co-founder, he runs a small software company. He's a software developer. I see myself as a people developer. Most of my career has been in professional development, higher education, HR. I just love finding people and looking at the glow in their eye, and if I can get excited about their product, that makes it even more rich. So, I mean, we're in a variety of sectors, from a cafe shop owner in downtown Durham, a tremendous visionary, and has a big dream that he set out to accomplish, to a scientist that was based here in the RTP area and eventually moved down to Atlanta. And is running a company that's addressing energy poverty and has developed a really neat intellectual property-driven technology addressing solar energy. A doctor out of Detroit. It's been a journey. The toughest part for us is to make sure we're not in something we can't contribute more than a check, right? So we're leaning a lot on our advisors and strategists that are around us, and the relationships we have here in the ecosystem to help us understand the space that we're in, above and beyond the fact that we're finding every day I just run into amazing people who have great ideas and opportunities, and we want to open up that access to them. So that's my
So Keith, you have a much broader thesis than Tim and Luann. So I want to go back to Tim and Luann because if I heard you correctly, it sounds like you mentioned partnerships, Tim. If you had the access to partner with, or if you knew of another firm that could invest, you would pass that on. So I'd like to find out more about that strategy. Is that something that your firm has attempted or successfully?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that everyone knows about the North Carolina ecosystem is how collaborative it is. I mean, we had speakers up here before that were talking about what's our secret sauce, and I think our secret sauce is the collaboration between the groups, a lot of whom are in this room. There's a lot of folks here that we've co-invested with. There's a lot of folks here we've passed deals off with. There's 2 people on stage right now that we just call each other and say, hey, what do you think about this opportunity or this one? And so, so there is a real collaborative nature here. I think that, so those partnerships are great, and that is part of the North Carolina secret sauce, I really do believe. Another thing that would be interesting is having professionally managed opportunity kind of funds, which are, here's some capital, whether that's state and private capital, some sort of mix, and it was a professionally managed fund that somebody could say, I can be opportunistic on a company that is scalable. There's very few limitations on what I can invest in so long as we think we're going to make a good return on it, but it's going to have impact and create jobs. I think that that's, I mean, that would be great if you could say, here's a great entrepreneur that I want to back. But again, then the challenge comes on the other side, raising a large enough fund to be able to manage that and do it effectively would be a challenge, though.
And do you know of current opportunity funds?
There's funds that are opportunistic, but but there's still some sort of limiting thesis, I would say, if they're going and raising a large enough fund that big checks are coming in from institutional type investors, whether pension funds or family offices or fund of funds. If they're writing big enough checks, they typically want a certain sector or segment that they're, or geography that they're investing in.
Sure. And Luann, as I was listening to you, I thought chicken and egg. Yeah. So you said something really key. I'd really love to see more entrepreneurs who have been there, done that, been successful. But in order to be there, do that, be successful, the resources have to be there, right, starting with the capital. Right. So talk to us about how you overcome that challenge in the ecosystem.
So I think that is where my other hat gets put on from an education standpoint. So I think there's a lot of information and education and support that can provide the needed skills to understand what it means to raise capital and what it means to build that business, alongside the support of early stage funds that are willing to take that risk. And I will tell you that the 7 deals we've done, 6 of them were our first time founders. So that's not stopping us from investing, but I would say it would help us get quicker returns so that we could raise more money so we could deploy more capital. So Tim's got his 3rd fund coming, right? And we're a small fund, but we know we need a big fund, and we need to have some quick returns, and I think that's what's going to help us more than anything. But I also think there are plenty of resources and other ways to find capital other than the traditional venture capital route that we all need to be educated on as well and really spend some time there.
Thank you. One of the other things that came to mind as you're speaking is, I look at it as access to equitable assets, equitable access to critical assets, I'd say, right? So, it's capital, it's the network, it's resources that might be non-financial. And so I'd like to know from each of the panelists how you leverage that within the ecosystem, whether it's with the startups that you are currently funding, or perhaps if you do work with startups that have the potential, but they're not where you need them to be, because that's also critical. If they can't get the funding today, but they can get the resources that get them to funding tomorrow, then we still can achieve that growth.
Sure. So as I said a moment ago, part of our recognition about trying to make impact is around that, looking at our own network. So we said, our focus was access to the capital, access to networks, and access to opportunities. And so we had to look in our network first. Again, very fortunate to have Lebone as a part of our team, our advisors in various sectors with various experiences. We have an advisor that made it all the way to Y Combinator, for example. and now works at Amazon. We connected it with one of our founders and got her into an Amazon-related ecosystem building accelerator model that they were putting together to help advance their sales and revenue growth. One of our attorneys in our network stepped in as well and helped clean up some of the IP issues with one of our companies. We've turned in other ways to folks who address, well, in our own case, in our own need as a growth emerging managers, we turn to folks who can help us tell our story better. And they in turn help our founders tell their stories better in presenting communication and sales and marketing and driving revenue streams. So we really reach out to our peer groups, pick up the phone, and we're fortunate we've been around a little while. Hope you can't tell that much all this gray hair I got, but I'm grateful to be in a position where I can call up folks that have been in the business for a long time, but both in terms of the higher education system at Duke University, where I spent and still have a teaching role there over nearly 36 years now, at the business school and other spaces when we see needs come up, and our founders are updating us saying, can you help us in this way? Help us find full stack developers. Well, my co-founder is a full stack developer. So again, anything from soup to nuts, we try to step in when we can help.
And I agree wholeheartedly, and that's what we strive to do well for our portfolio companies as well as entrepreneurs in the community, connecting to not just people, but places, and the opportunity to connect with other folks that are in similar space, in similar place, in similar stage, so that you've got sounding boards, but also really truly connecting to the ecosystem and picking up the phone. And Betsy sent an email a couple of weeks ago and said, we've got this person we're talking to, we think, that need resources before we can really support them. How do you support them? As well as even corporations. And I think that's why it's important that we understand our communities and where we're strong and where we can really support early stage and entrepreneurs in that place.
So in terms of equitable access to these resources, there's a reason why I spend so much time with NC IDEA through the years. There's a reason why I'm on the executive committee for the Council for Entrepreneurial Development. They have the NC IDEA Labs program. They have the CED Grow program for companies that are coming in at the earliest stages. They all have access to my information. Every university I go and talk to, their entrepreneurship programs, they have access to my information. Every startup at one of Jim Roberts' events in Wilmington has my information. And through that, they have access to my network, the attorneys, the investors, whoever can make them helpful and successful. And we keep it part of our mission to say, hey, if you're going to reach out, and I might tell you right away, hey, we're not going to invest, but here are 1, 2, 3 different ways I think I can help. And so those entrepreneurs have, I try to be intentional that they have access to the resources that we have, so it's more equitable for them.
Great, thank you. So how about we shift to impact then? Because it sounds like there are efforts that are made, but I always find it interesting when statistics are given, which we all know the stats, you can look them up, you can Google them, we hear them all the time, but there's always an element of surprise when they're stated. And I wonder if that's because at a macro level, perhaps they're tracked, but are they being tracked at a micro level? Are your firms tracking the impact? Are you tracking how funds move through your funnel? Are you tracking how many women-owned businesses get the funding? How many Black and brown-owned businesses? How many indigenous-owned businesses? Are you tracking that? Talk to me about what you do track and what types of metrics you have so that you know you are having ecosystem impact. And I say this because we can't say we're having ecosystem impact if we're not focused on equitable impact, right? So.
Do you mind if I start this one? As a fund managed by 3 white guys that's invested in over 80% white males, like let me go ahead and jump in and say what we're doing here, because I understand how it looks, right? Well, you realize a couple things. One, you look for software companies, right? So somebody that's been a software developer before, or someone that's started a software company before, or when we go to hire on our team and the first thing we write is we would like some previous venture capital experience. Well, guess what kind of applications you get for stuff like that, right? You're creating this, you know, this flywheel of people that look more like you, and you're not increasing your network. So you have to be intentional about changing that. So what are we doing? We did a DEI study across not only our team, but across all of our portfolio companies, the boards, the board of advisors, and what do those look like? And all we can do from now is get better. So what are we doing to get better? What we're doing to get better is where we can have velocity, where we can change things quickly and really have an impact, we do it a lot and we really hammer it home. So let me give you a few examples. We'll have 5 or 10 interns at our venture capital fund every year. How are we making sure that half of our intern groups are getting venture capital exposure to the management teams of our portfolio companies? When we're hiring inside of our portfolio companies, which we're doing at a much faster clip than we're doing at our own fund, how do we make sure that final candidates, there's diversity in the final candidate pool before they make selections? How are we tracking those kind of things that we're doing on a regular basis, the kind of deal flow we're getting in? That's where volume and impact, it might take a little while for it to play out, but we're being intentional in tracking that stuff.
And we are tracking. We've got 7 investments, like I said, 1 woman-owned and 2 minority-owned. And so we're really excited about that, but we're also not thrilled with that because we know that diverse portfolios improve returns. And so we're really looking at that really closely. From a tracking standpoint, the ones that we do due diligence on, yes, I'm tracking, but we often don't know we can tell whether they're male or female, what their gender is, but often don't know their ethnicity because it's truly an application and we may have 1 phone call because they just don't fit our criteria as closely as we should. So, but the ones we do meet with, we're absolutely tracking. And it's not like Tim, it's not a great record, but again, paying attention.
Well, again, I'd like to feel like I can celebrate the commitment that we made in 2018, really around 2017. My co-founder, who happens to be an older white male, who's run a successful software company and has kind of been on this journey, his personal journey around racial equity, and really made a real commitment in his own life to move from philanthropy to investing. And when he invited me on this journey with him, I said, I'm down for that. Especially because I spent so much time in the higher education system prior to the higher education system starting to double down and focus on innovation and entrepreneurship at the university systems. I was already working with high school students since the mid-90s on the opportunity for private enterprise working in corporate America and so forth. So we said, okay, we're going to make our thesis about putting, addressing the wealth gap, addressing this egregious gap in venture capital. And so when I hear the numbers, I'm like, okay, I'm tired of those numbers. They are what they are. We're going to strike out, and we turned to friends and family, essentially, and had to put their trust in us with not direct experience on doing this work and then relying on a lot of much more smarter folks to help us build this first fund. And we have come in even greater proximity to the challenge at hand that makes it almost look like we're not making a difference. And I think we have to have that 30-year. We talk about the investment cycle. I mean, it's high risk, first of all, and it's also long term. This is not get rich quick, right? So to be committed to think, okay, so 30 years from now, what will the impact look like? And if I'm doing my job well, it'll first look like more folks who look like me won't be afraid to approach the consideration of scalability, because I'm in that proximate space and say, yes, you can. And let's think about how you do that. Let's help you build your team. So I spend about 10 to 15 hours a week just in conversation with entrepreneurs that from wherever they are. I open up my 30-minute calendar and just invest in those conversations, Lebone is that weight as well. I don't know how we find the time and space, but we make it because we know how important it is to be that close to seeing the possibility of your idea going far greater than just a what we call a lifestyle business, which we kind of tend to default to in our space. So for me, the question is there, and it does sometimes bear the pain of seeing the numbers consistently, but I take that 30-year view and kind of as a farmer, and I am grateful for NC Idea moving into Provident. That's that proximate commitment to community and relationships, because that's where, for me, the real money is made, the real wealth is made through trusted, committed, proximate relationships that actually are genuine about seeing that shared growth, that growth vision. Yeah, I need to, again, full disclosure, I'm really a theologian, impersonating a venture capitalist, and it's been really hard to do because I'm honest when I say about this pursuit of a moral arc that changes the narrative when it comes to how we experience prosperity in this country with this less than wonderful capitalistic system that has been built in a particular way that makes it more and more less likely that I could take a seat like this. In fact, my co-founder likes to say, I had a college football career that I was more likely to make it in the NFL or to make $500,000 in the NFL than I could in raising capital for a company. And that's something that is a big problem, to say the least. So.
Thank you. I love what you said about the long game. I'm paraphrasing. But I like that concept of the long game, because that is what we play in venture capital. In angel, I was an angel investor. I've been an angel investor for 10 years. Angel investing is a long game. And you have to believe in the company and the founder and what they're putting into the market. And so if we launched this meter out 30 years, what can you change? I understand the theses, we've talked about it on this platform. I understand the restrictions that tighten the funnel. I understand the statistics that has produced. But if we looked out 30 years and said, what can we start changing that can make a difference 30 years from now to significantly move this needle? What can your firm do, or what can you do from your position?
I'll dive in. I really, truly believe that as we look 30 years out, and I've been doing this for 25 years, I've seen great progress, but not enough. I mean, not even close. And so I think part of what we have to do as an ecosystem is educate investors. It's educate the community to the importance of equitable access to all of the resources that are needed for entrepreneurs. I think I feel like oftentimes we preach to the choir instead of to the audience. And I think that's part of what we have to do a better job of from an advocacy standpoint, from a data standpoint, from a standing up and shouting from the rafters standpoint. Because we are not going to be successful as a community if we're not supporting all entrepreneurs wherever they're at. So I think it's an education piece, and I think it's incumbent upon us.
I don't want 30 years from now, I hope that there's not an entrepreneur with a good idea and a good business that can make real money that I can't say, here's where you should go to raise capital, right? In North Carolina. Like that shouldn't be a problem that we have, or that the only way you're gonna get it is through some sort of grant. If it's a real business that can make real money and really scale, you should be able to find, a private investor, a mix of private and government funding, whatever it is, that can fund your business and you can generate real returns. And I think that how we get there 30 years from now is to support emerging fund managers that aren't in the same spaces. I mean, the large funds that we have around here, me and some of my other venture colleagues, we all look at the same deals. We kind of overlap in the spaces that we invest. And even though there might be more capital to deploy, it's capital in an overlapping segment. And so there's still a lot of entrepreneurs that get left out on the fringes that aren't going to know where to turn and raise capital. So how do we support more diverse, emerging funds, groups, sources of capital, so that 30 years from now, there's not an entrepreneur with a great business that we don't know where to turn it to?
That's a great point. Now, we know that human behavior often requires incentives. It just is what it is. People do what they're incentivized to do. And so from your vantage point and viewpoint, what can be done at a macro level in the ecosystem to incentivize this? Because I love the ideas, right? I think I absolutely agree that 30 years from now, that will have impact if there's actual movement. So,
Well, I was thinking, to the prior question, the challenge of the systems, right? The systems that work against, that create the disparity, that create the inequity, and it's complex. In some ways, we think some things could be easily addressed, but then you realize, easy is on the other side of complexity, as one of my professors used to say. So you think about our political system, our education system, and obviously venture and capitalism, and being able to work across sectors and to have leverage so that there is more incentives to make it really more painful not to step more deeply and more intentionally into the reality of creating wealth through greater diversity and through a spreading out of shared economic prosperity. And so that's the hope and vision that I see that is important, that we make time to quote unquote step across the aisle when we know the aisles are that much more treacherous nowadays to go across, given the realities in which we've lived and are currently living in. But we need to have the courage to do that in our spheres of influence. And break some of the barriers, and quite honestly, it's more of our wealthy white peers kind of having to step in our direction versus me found a way in your rooms, and then to figure out when I will be heard, right? So, just be real. We just know that's not a simple equation to deal, because we don't the basis of trust and relationships that need to be there to carry that weight. But I've now since lost your most recent question. But
how do we incentivize the behavior?
Yeah, and so the other thing, I'm grateful for the resurgence of commitment around the coalescing of our best talent and genius across many sectors, and the Black community in particular, building up that base of legacy that we have, particularly that it so drove us in Durham to create this fund. And so, again, relationships like we get to build with our peers in the space as well, and having honest conversations, reaching out to each other. Tim, you've been great. I'll put you on the spot right now when we call and give me some of your best mistakes so we don't make them, right?
There's a lot of them. Thanks.
Yeah. but I mean, that's real. Every business has to, on some level, be able to traverse those multi-sector spaces.
On specific incentives to affect behavior, and on the education piece. So I'll give you a very specific example. We're gone out and we've been raising this last fund, and all of a sudden you start talking about the 1202 small qualified business tax credit, right? And with that, in the state of North Carolina, if you meet certain criteria as investing in an early stage company, you can pay 0 state or federal tax on your gains. 0 state or federal tax. And so I'll be giving a pitch to a potential investor, and they're about to fall asleep, and then I mention that they pay 0 tax on their gains, and all of a sudden they wake up and they want to invest in our fund. That's a mix of incentives, and it's a mix of education. So I look at something very practical like that as an incentive to encourage investing. And then I really think that the big pockets of money, right? You look at government money that's coming in. We just saw how much money goes to some of these large corporations, which God, I wish I had some of that money to start a opportunity venture fund. I mean, wouldn't that be nice, right? But if we had that, and you had these pockets of money from pension funds and state funds, and as they start flowing down, there was some pressure or mandate on where those monies would be spent. The investors putting the money at the ground level are going to adapt to where those buckets of money are coming from. The example I'll give you is if, and we do this now, when we budget with our companies that they will spend X amount in DEI, or they will spend X amount on executive coaching, if they want our $1.5 million, guess what they're gonna do? They're going to put that money into those buckets because we're requiring it. And as you go up into these larger pools of money, if those criteria come with that investment, you're going to see people at the earlier stages, at the lower end of the funnel that are about to deploy that capital, you're going to see them adapt their behavior.
I think one of the other things, and if I didn't bring this up, I'd be remiss. We used to have a business venture tax credit in this state. It was called the Qualified Business Venture Tax Credit. And there's a small group of us that have been working on getting that back into the legislature and getting that re-upped. And one of the things that we did as this working group was very specifically indicate a higher tax incentive rate if you invested in rural or minority-owned businesses. And I think that is a real game changer that we could do as a state and a community. And so as we think about the long session that starts in January at our state in Raleigh, know that we may be reaching out to this ecosystem, this small group of us that's working on it, and saying, please write your local and state representatives and encourage them that this will be game-changing in our ecosystem, and know that we're committed to making sure that those additional incentive rates would be included in that.
I said this on a call we had a couple weeks ago, but if you start with investing in diverse founders or rural communities across the state, if you start telling investors that they should do that because it's the right thing to do and it'll make you more money, some of them, when you start with it's the right thing to do, some of them just won't act. It's just where we are. But if you start with it will make you more money and it's the right thing to do, you will have 100% buy-in. And so as we talk about these, it's unfortunate, but that's the truth.
It's the reality.
And so, could you just for a moment if anyone in the room is interested in supporting that effort, would you mind letting them know how they can get in contact? Is there an email address they can?
Well, right now it would be mine.
Okay. Okay.
But we can add you to our list of working group, and you can find me at firstlaunchcapitalfund.com or launchgreensboro.com, and my email address is really hard because I've got a really long name.
It's okay.
So just find me there, or I've got business cards I can share.
And I wanted to pause on that because there's strength in numbers. And so when I look across this room and I listen to you say, well, this is the effort we're pushing for, it's a few of us.
There's a lot of y'all
There's
here.
a whole lot of
hooray.
support that can come behind that. So thank you. So earlier, I asked the entrepreneurs in the room to stand, and you saw how many stood. You saw how few stood who had actually raised capital, and then when we just had entrepreneurs stand, almost half this room, it felt like, were standing. Can you speak to some advice, some strategies that entrepreneurs can utilize and act when approaching VCs for funding? Because for some, it's a black box. And because there's not enough education on both sides, on the investor side as well as on the founder side, or not enough appropriate education happening, oftentimes founders find themselves going in circles. They hear that there's all this money on the other side of the wall. No one knows how to scale the wall. And then the person who scales the wall stands at the top of the wall and says, I got it, I got my funding. And they're like, how'd you get it? We can't hear you down here. Okay? So let's let's take the wall down and get some real advice from the three of you that these entrepreneurs who stood up can take home, some practical advice when approaching for VC funding, when raising capital.
So I want you to know where I come from when I say this, which is in our last couple funds of raising real money, it's been over 600 first meetings with potential investors, okay? First meetings. So I've heard probably more no's than most of even the entrepreneurs that are out there that have been trying to raise money. You're too early, you're too small, you're not going to generate big enough returns, or I don't like that, I don't invest in that geography. I've heard all that, okay? So the advice not only for the entrepreneurs, but from my perspective has been, one, do your work ahead of time and have a highly curated list of people that you're going in and investing in. Put yourself in the investor's seat. Would they invest in you based on their thesis and what they need to do? If your goal is to turn a company and sell it for $10 million, is a $100 million venture fund going to invest in your business? Probably not. Take them off the list, okay? And then the second thing I would say is, if you do talk to investors and the answer is no, a meeting with an investor that's a no, but an introduction to 3 or 4 folks in their network, that's a big win in a meeting. And when I feel like an entrepreneur comes and they get a no, but here's people I can introduce you to, and I still know they take that as a bad meeting, like they think of it as a loss, I have very little hope that an entrepreneur is going to actually be able to raise capital.
Everything he said,
Yes.
which is
Ditto.
we've been on over the last 2 years. We've been on maybe like 4 panels together, and I'm like, man, I'm grateful to have be in proximity of some really great people. And now that I've lived in North Carolina and most of my education here, I'm grateful that I'm in this incredible space, incredibly talented people. If you don't have a team and you're solos and you've been doing it a while, that's a problem. It's who's your team? Who are your advisors, and how have you selected them, and how much do you engage them? For me, that is huge. And most of my life has been in teams. I've been very fortunate to be on some amazing teams, and so that's what I'm excited when I look for when I see a founder is who's supporting you, who's surrounding you, or how are you going about building that? Some folks call it networking. The other thing I look for is that genuine, that integrity. Integrity and accountability. I mean, if we know you're in it for money, but you can't, and as I agree with what you said, but you got to lead with relationships. You got to lead with, like, I want to build a relationship. So even before you have to ask for money, you can be seeking to build those relationships, and trusting that it'll lead to some good outcomes when you really need that capital. So I'll stop there.
Ditto and ditto. So. The thing that I would add is truly, if you've never been in this space before, don't be afraid to ask basic questions. That is going to get key data points that you need to understand. This curated list of potential investors, that is vital. I ran the Piedmont Angel Network Fund 1 and started Fund 2, and you don't want to know how many calls I got for folks raising money for movies. Why, I don't know, but they did. And it became a joke, so we finally on our website said we don't invest in movies, right? So just doing that homework and know that this ecosystem is here. Even investors, even the folks that oftentimes people are like, oh, they'd never talk to me. We will. You really want to know, and this connect point that we've all talked about, I've only been here for 3 hours, and I think I've heard it 5 times. The connect point that is North Carolina and the entrepreneurial ecosystem, we're here. We are here to support you as entrepreneurs. We are here to support each other as ecosystem advocates. And so just please don't be afraid to ask.
Great. Did you?
No, I'm good.
Do we have time for a question? No. So we are at time. But
Jim, do you know how to get a hold of me?
Jim, yeah.
I'd be happy to answer after.
I believe the contact information for our panelists are available. No.
You can figure it out.
All right, please approach them because we are at time, and we want to be respectful of time. Can we get a round of applause for these amazing
Thanks,
ecosystem advocates? Thank you so much.